Hello and welcome, dear listener, to where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Pull your armchair a little closer to the fire, for tonight we return to those fog-wrapped days when I shared rooms with the world's only consulting detective. Tonight's chronicle I have titled, Chapter 1, The Visitor at Dawn. It was one of those raw, stealthy November mornings in 1894 when the fog of London seems less a weather than a living creature, a vast yellow-gray beast that presses its damp paws against every window pane and slips cold fingers down the collars of the hardiest men. I had passed a restless night. The old wound in my shoulder ached with the damp, and the wind rattling the casements of 221B Baker Street had sounded more than once, like the distant moan of a dying soldier on the Afghan plain. At length I rose, performed what meager toilet the hour allowed, and descended the 17 steps to our sitting room, expecting to find Holmes still buried in the cushions of the sofa amid a chaos of newspapers. Instead, to my astonishment, he was already up and dressed, standing at the bow window in his mouse-colored dressing gown, hands clasped behind him, staring down into the street with that peculiar stillness which, in him, betokened the highest excitement. "Watson," said he without turning, "we are about to receive a visitor whose boots are caked with the red clay of Belgravia, and whose nerves are in a state of the most exquisite disarray. Be so good as to poke the fire and place the spirit kettle within reach. The man will need brandy, and I may need tea." I had long ceased to wonder at such pronouncements. Obediently, I stirred the coals into a blaze and set out the decanter and glasses. I had scarcely done so when Mrs. Hudson's knock fell upon the door, sharper and more urgent than is her wont. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she said, putting her head in. Her face was pale, and there was that in her eye which told me the visitor had startled even her accustomed composure. "He will not give his name, sir, but he says it is a matter of life and death, and he looks it." "Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied, and there was a note of eagerness in his voice I had not heard for weeks. A moment later the door opened again, and the man who entered seemed to bring the fog itself in with him, so thickly did it cling to the folds of his sodden ulster. His top hat was crushed and dripping, his gloves were black with wet, and his face, when he raised it to the light, was of that ghastly whiteness which comes only from extreme terror or extreme exhaustion. He was perhaps 40 years of age, tall, well-made, and in ordinary circumstances would have been handsome. But at that instant he looked like a man who had seen the gates of hell standing ajar. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked in a voice that shook despite evident efforts at control. Holmes inclined his head. "The same. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, in whose discretion you may place entire confidence. Pray take the basket chair by the fire, Mr. The stranger hesitated, glanced over his shoulder as though fearing pursuit even here, and then, with a gesture of despair, threw himself into the chair. "My name is Felix Carver," he said at last. "I am a solicitor of Carver, and Ambrose, Lincoln's Inn. Mr. Holmes, I have come to you because I am in danger of my life. No, worse, I stand accused of a murder I did not commit, and unless you help me, I shall be hanged for it within the month." He paused, passed a trembling hand across his brow, and accepted with gratitude the glass of brandy I pressed upon him. Holmes had seated himself opposite, his thin, eager face thrust forward, his eyelids drooping in that drowsy affectation which I knew masked the keenest attention. "Proceed, Mr. Carver," said he quietly. "Begin, if you please, at the beginning, and omit no detail, however trivial it may appear to you." Carver drew a long breath, drank again, and began. "Yesterday evening, no, I forget the hour, it feels a lifetime ago, I dined at the Belgravia mansion of my client, Sir Reginald Hawthorne. Sir Reginald was a baronet of considerable wealth, a widower, and a passionate collector of antique firearms. He had invited 3 guests, myself as his solicitor, Major Horace Blaine, an old brother officer from his Indian days, and Miss Eleanor Voss, his ward and, as we all supposed, his heiress. The occasion was the private exhibition of a pair of dueling pistols once owned by the Emperor Napoleon, priceless objects which Sir Reginald had lately acquired at auction for a fabulous sum. Dinner passed pleasantly enough. Sir Reginald was in high spirits, the Major full of military anecdotes, Miss Voss silent but gracious. At 10:30, Sir Reginald proposed that we adjourn to his private armory on the 2nd floor to view the pistols by lamplight. The armory is a strong room, windowless save for a small ventilator near the ceiling, entered by a single steel door to which Sir Reginald alone possessed the key. He unlocked it with a flourish, ushered us inside, and for 20 minutes we stood entranced while he displayed his treasures. Flintlocks, wheel locks, pepper boxes, revolvers of every nation and every age, all arranged under glass with the loving care of a museum curator. At length, Sir Reginald placed the Napoleonic pistols upon the central mahogany desk, invited us to examine them, and then announced that he wished to consult certain papers in his study on the floor below. He begged us to remain in the armory to continue our admiration, and promised to return within a quarter of an hour. He locked the door upon us from the outside. There is a trick to the Yale lock which allows this, and we heard his footsteps descend the stairs. Major Blaine, Miss Voss, and I remained inside conversing in low tones, for the atmosphere of that chamber, surrounded by its silent arsenal, was strangely oppressive. 11 o'clock struck, then a quarter past. Sir Reginald did not return. The Major grew restless, paced the narrow space between the cabinets, and at last declared that something must be amiss. He hammered upon the steel door and shouted. There was no reply. By great good fortune, the old butler, Grimshaw, was at that very moment coming up the servants' stair with a tray of coffee. He heard the Major's shouts, hurried along the corridor, and confirmed that Sir Reginald had never reached the study. Alarmed, the Major put his shoulder to the door and, being a powerful man, burst the lock. We found Sir Reginald seated at the desk exactly as he had left us, his head fallen forward upon the blotter, a neat bullet hole in his right temple, and a thin stream of blood trickling down his cheek. Yet, and this is the horror of it, Mr. Holmes, no pistol lay upon the desk or floor, nor could we find one anywhere in the room after the most frantic search. The door had been locked from the outside. The ventilator is scarcely 6 inches square. There is no other means of entrance. And no shot had been heard. Not by us in the corridor, not by Grimshaw at the baize door, not by the maids below stairs. Inspector Lestrade arrived within the hour. He searched my overcoat hanging in the cloakroom and discovered in the right-hand pocket a cardboard box containing 12 .32 caliber cartridges. Cartridges whose box bore my fingerprints plainly upon the lid. I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I have never seen that box only once before, when Sir Reginald showed it to me months ago as part of his collection. Someone placed it in my coat while we waited in the corridor. Lestrade has arrested me. I was taken to the cells at Gerald Row Police Station, but my partner obtained bail until tomorrow morning. By tomorrow night I shall be back behind bars unless you can prove my innocence. He ceased, and for a long minute the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the ceaseless drip of water from his coat upon our carpet. Holmes had listened without movement, save that his long, nervous fingers had drummed a soft tattoo upon the arm of his chair. Now he rose, crossed to the window, and stood looking down into Baker Street as though the crawling fog itself might yield up its secret. "Most remarkable," he murmured at last. "A murder in a sealed room committed with a weapon that vanishes like smoke, and accompanied by no report, and leaving a trail that points with damning precision at an innocent man. Tell me, Mr. Carver, at what exact minute was the muffled sound heard which you took to be Sir Reginald falling?" at precisely 17 minutes past 11 by the ormolu clock upon the mantel. And the wound, powder burning? None that I could see, though the blood obscured much. Holmes wheeled round, his eyes gleaming like steel. Then the affair is even more extraordinary than you know. Watson, the Reichenbach coat and the ulster with the ear flaps. Mr. Carver, you have come to the one who can help you if any man can. We shall visit the scene of this impossible crime within the hour. And as the church bells of London began to chime 6 through the fog, I knew that another page had turned in the strangest volume of my friend's extraordinary career. Chapter 2. The Curious Tale of the Silent Pistol. The fog was still thick when our hansom clattered to a halt before the Hawthorne mansion in Belgravia, a tall, somber house blackened by decades of London soot. Gas lamps burned feebly along the railings, their halos swallowed by the yellow vapor that drifted in slow coils across the empty street. Grimshaw the butler admitted us with the air of a man who had not slept and never expected to sleep again. His hands trembled as he took our coats, and his eyes avoided those of Carver as though the poor solicitor already wore a felon's brand. Holmes wasted no time on ceremony. With Carver trailing behind like a condemned man and myself bringing up the rear, we mounted the wide staircase to the second floor. The corridor was narrow, carpeted in dark crimson, lit by a single gas jet turned low. At the far end stood the steel door of the armory, its lock freshly splintered by the major's shoulder the night before. A constable in uniform stood guard. He came to attention at the sight of us, but Holmes brushed past him as though he did not exist. The armory itself was a long, narrow chamber that smelled faintly of gun oil and old leather. Every wall was lined with glass-fronted cabinets in which reposed weapons of every age, basket-hilted broadswords, matchlocks, blunderbusses, tiny muff pistols no longer than a lady's finger, and row upon row of dueling pieces in velvet-lined cases. In the center stood the mahogany desk at which Sir Reginald had died. A chalk outline and a dark stain upon the blotter marked the place where his head had lain. Holmes paused upon the threshold, drawing a deep breath as though the very air could speak to him. Then, dropping to his hands and knees with that sudden feline grace I knew so well, he began his examination. I have seen him thus 100 times, yet the spectacle never ceases to astonish. The greatest brain in Europe crawling upon the floor like a bloodhound. First he studied the carpet inch by inch from door to desk, his lens held close to the pile, then the desk itself, the position of the chair pushed back exactly 14 inches, the blotter, the scattered papers, the 2 magnificent Napoleonic pistols still lying where Sir Reginald had placed them for admiration. He lifted the dead man's chair, turned it upside down, examined the underside of the seat with minute care. He measured the angle of the wound from the chalk outline, muttering figures under his breath. Carver watched in an agony of impatience. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he burst out, at last. Holmes raised a thin hand for silence. He had moved to the tiny ventilator high in the wall. Standing upon a chair, he examined the grill, then inserted the blade of his penknife and prized it loose. A faint shower of dust drifted down. "Removed and replaced within the last 48 hours, he murmured. Note the brighter screw heads and the absence of cobwebs. Yet the aperture is only 6 inches by 4, impossible for even the slimmest man." He replaced the grill, leapt lightly down, and turned his attention to the floorboards beneath the desk. There, almost invisible to the polished oak, lay a tiny circular scratch no wider than a sixpence. Perfectly round, perfectly fresh. "Hello," said Holmes softly. "Here is something." From his pocket he drew a length of fine silk thread and a lead fishing weight. Knotting the weight to the thread, he lowered it through the scratch until it touched the carpet beneath. Then, sighting along the thread, he looked upward. Watson, be so good as to stand here. Now tell me, does the thread point directly to the ventilator? I obeyed. No, I said, surprised. It points to the ceiling, almost to the center of the room. Holmes's eyes blazed. Precisely. The bullet did not enter horizontally. It descended from above. Carver stared at him as though he had taken leave of his senses. From above? But there is no room above the armory save the attic, and the attic floor is solid oak 2 inches thick. Holmes smiled that thin, dangerous smile I had seen before only in moments of triumph. We shall see, Mr. Carver, we shall see. At that instant the door opened and Inspector Lestrade entered, rubbing his hands with professional satisfaction. Behind him loomed the burly form of Major Blaine, his face brick red, his mustache bristling with indignation. Ah, Mr. Holmes, said Lestrade with heavy sarcasm. Come to admire my handcuffs on Mr. Carver, I suppose. The evidence is overwhelming, sir. The cartridges in the gentleman's pocket, the motive of £80,000, the locked room. Why, it's as plain as the nose on your face. Holmes regarded the little detective with mild amusement. Indeed. Then perhaps you can explain, Lestrade, why no powder residue whatever was found upon the wound, though the muzzle must have been pressed to the temple. Or why the bullet itself, here it is, recovered from the wainscot, is made not of lead but of aluminium, a metal almost unknown in commercial ammunition. Lestrade's face fell. Major Blaine gave a snort of disbelief. Aluminium? Repeated Carver faintly. Exactly so, said Holmes, holding up the tiny missile to the light. It gleamed with a dull, silvery sheen, strangely light in his palm. A projectile weighing scarcely a quarter of the usual bullet, fired without smoke and almost without sound. Your pistol, Lestrade, was never in the room at all. It was fired from above through a hole, no wider than a finger, and the weapon itself has been spirited away as neatly as any conjurer's trick. He turned to Carver and his voice softened. Take heart, my dear sir. You are innocent, and before another day has passed I shall prove it beyond the shadow of a doubt. Come, Watson, the game is afoot. And with that he strode from the room, leaving Lestrade gaping and Major Blaine tugging at his mustache in baffled fury, while the fog outside pressed ever closer against the windows, as though the very city held its breath for the revelation to come. Chapter 3. The scene of the impossible crime. We left the armory in a state of suppressed electricity, Lestrade still spluttering behind us and Major Blaine muttering that the whole affair was damned nonsense. Holmes, however, moved with the swift certainty of a man who has already seen the end of the maze. He paused only to request that Grimshaw conduct us to every room directly above the armory, beginning with Sir Reginald's own bedroom. The butler led us up a narrower stairs to the 3rd floor. Sir Reginald's bedroom was a spacious apartment overlooking the square, furnished with heavy mahogany and hung with dark portraits of Hawthorne ancestors in armor. A fire had burned low in the grate. The air still held the faint, expensive scent of Russian leather and macassar oil. The bed was turned down but unslept in, for the baronet had died before he could seek it. Holmes crossed at once to the exact spot above the armory desk, judged by pacing from the party wall. He rapped the floorboards with his cane, listened to the note, then dropped to his knees again. For fully 5 minutes he crawled, nose almost touching the carpet, until a low exclamation of satisfaction escaped him. Here, Watson, mark this. Beneath the edge of a thick Persian rug, the boards showed a circular patch, no larger than a half-crown, where the grain had been neatly sawn through and a plug replaced so cunningly that only the closest scrutiny revealed the hair-fine seam. Holmes inserted the blade of his pocket-knife, prized upward, and the plug came free like the lid of a snuff-box. Through the aperture one looked directly down into the armory. The top of the mahogany desk and the chalk outline were perfectly visible. Carver gave a gasp of horror. Then the murderer was in this room. Or entered it, corrected Holmes quietly. Observe that the hole has been bored from beneath, not from above. The sawdust lies in the armory, not here. The assassin worked from the locked room itself at some earlier date, then replaced the plug and covered it with the rug. On the night of the crime, he or she had only to ascend to this bedroom, lift the plug, and fire downward. He stood, dusting his knees, and turned to the window. It was a tall sash, unlatched, opening onto a narrow balcony of wrought iron. Holmes flung it wide. The fog rolled in like smoke. "Note the fresh scratches upon the inside of the lower sash," said he, "made by a boot heel as someone climbed in or out. And here upon the balcony rail a few fibers of mauve silk caught upon a rough rivet. Most suggestive." Carver shook his head in bewilderment. "But the bedroom door was found locked this morning, and the key in Sir Reginald's pocket along with the armory key." "Exactly so," replied Holmes. "Therefore our murderer either possessed a duplicate or never used the door at all." He leaned far out into the fog, peering downward. The wall below the balcony was smooth stucco, but to the left ran the main rainwater pipe, newly repaired. A stretch of 4 or 5 feet separated the balcony from the pipe, a leap possible only to a desperate or agile person, and the return climb assisted by the ornamental iron trellis that supported a leafless creeper. Holmes withdrew his head, his cheekbones flushed with excitement. "Grimshaw," he called sharply, "when was the pipe repaired?" "Only last week, sir. The lower joint burst in the frost. The builders left a patch of fresh cement at the foot, still soft." Holmes's smile was almost boyish. "Watson, I believe we shall find footprints in that cement, footprints which will speak more plainly than any confession." We descended at once. The area beneath the pipe was a narrow strip shadowed by the area railings. The patch of new cement, some 3 feet square, gleamed palely in the gloom. And there, unmistakable despite the light film of soot that had begun to settle, were the delicate impressions of a woman's shoe, narrow, high-arched, size 4 at most, with the left heel worn distinctly outward. Holmes knelt, produced his tape, and measured with care. Length 5 3/4 inches, width barely 2. The left heel shows a patch of unusual wear, precisely as though the wearer habitually throws her weight to the outer edge, perhaps to ease an old injury. Most interesting. He straightened and looked at Carver. "Tell me, sir, does Miss Eleanor Voss by any chance limp slightly upon the left foot?" Carver stared. "Why, yes, she suffered a riding accident as a child. But surely you cannot suspect Miss Voss. She is Sir Reginald's ward, his heiress. She was with us in the corridor when the alarm was raised." Holmes's expression was inscrutable. "Inheritance is a powerful motive, Mr. Carver, and heirs have been known to grow impatient, yet we must not leap to conclusions. The footprints prove only that a woman of small stature climbed the pipe, probably twice, once to enter and once to leave. The mauve fibers suggest a lady. The rest remains to be demonstrated." He turned to Grimshaw, who had followed us down, his face a study in consternation. "Grimshaw, you were on duty at the baize door at the end of the second-floor corridor throughout the evening?" "Yes, sir." "Never left my post from 9 o'clock until the major broke the door." "And you heard no shot?" "Not a sound, sir, save the thud when the master fell." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. That will do." He drew me aside as Grimshaw retreated. "The absence of sound is the crux, Watson. A normal pistol fired in that bedroom would have been heard throughout the house. Therefore, the weapon was either heavily silenced, an improbable device in 1894, or it was no powder weapon at all. I incline to the latter. Come, we have much to do and the fog is lifting. I must visit certain gunsmiths in the Strand who deal in curiosities from the continent." As we climbed back into the hansom, Carver clinging to the hope Holmes had given him, I could not resist one question. Holmes, the aluminium bullet, a silent weapon, a hole bored from beneath. Do you already know the hole? He leaned back against the cushions, his eyes half closed. I know enough to save an innocent man from the gallows, Watson. As for the rest, the footprints in the cement have begun to speak, and before the night is out they will have told us everything. The cab rattled away into the thinning fog, and I confess my pulse beat faster, for I knew that look upon my friend's face. The hunter had scented blood, and the impossible crime was already ceasing to be impossible. Chapter 4. 3 men and a missing bullet. The fog had thinned to a pale haze by late afternoon, and London lay washed in a cold, steel-colored light that made every brick and pane gleam like wet blood. Holmes had been absent since luncheon, flitting from gunsmith to gunsmith along the Strand and Charing Cross Road, returning only when the gas lamps were lit and the streets filled with the clatter of home-going hansoms. He entered our sitting room at Baker Street with the stride, threw hat and coat across the sofa, and dropped into his armchair with that peculiar mixture of exhaustion and triumph that I had seen after the most difficult chases. "Well, Watson?" I asked eagerly. He lighted his oldest pipe, the blackened clay, and sent a cloud of blue smoke toward the ceiling. "The weapon exists," said he. "Is an Austrian pneumatic cane pistol patented in Vienna in 1891 by a certain Herr Dr. Lucas Ritter. It resembles an ordinary walking stick, but the ferrule unscrews to reveal a short rifled barrel scarcely 3 inches long. The stock is in truth a hollow aluminium reservoir charged with compressed carbonic acid gas. The trigger is concealed in the handle. The bullets are turned aluminium cylinders weighing barely 40 grains each. The report is no louder than the popping of a champagne cork, and at 10 feet it is inaudible in the next room. Only 9 specimens were ever made. One of them was sold privately last year to Sir Reginald Hawthorne for the astonishing sum of 225 guineas. It was delivered to this house in a plain deal box addressed in a feminine hand. Then Sir Reginald himself owned the very instrument of his death. Precisely the irony that appeals to me, said Holmes dryly. He purchased a curiosity which in the wrong hands became the perfect silent assassin. The aluminium bullet we recovered matches exactly the test rounds fired by Ritter in his patent application. The upward angle is now explained. The bullet was fired downward through the plug hole. The natural drop of even so light a projectile over 12 feet caused the slight upward entry into the temple. The weapon, being part of the collection, was simply returned to its place upon the wall after the murder, and no one thought to examine a walking stick among 200 others. But the cane was not found in the armory inventory after the crime, I objected. Holmes's eyes twinkled. Because it was never upon the wall to begin with. Sir Reginald, fearing the very misuse to which it was put, had hidden it in his bedroom behind a false panel in the wardrobe. The assassin knew that hiding place. Chapter 5. The lady in mauve night had fallen hard over Belgravia, a moonless, starless night in which the gas lamps along the square burned like isolated souls struggling against the dark. Holmes and I, dressed as gas-fitters in coarse jackets and peaked caps, slipped through the area gate of the Hawthorne mansion at 11:30. Grimshaw had been paid handsomely to turn a blind eye and to leave the kitchen door on the latch. The house lay silent, wrapped in mourning. Only the ticking of clocks and the occasional creak of old wood disturbed the stillness. We moved on stockinged feet up the back stairs to Sir Reginald's bedroom. A single candle in Holmes's hand threw long, leaping shadows across the walls. He went straight to the great mahogany wardrobe that dominated one corner, flung open the doors, and began tapping the back panel with the handle of his lens. At the third blow, a hollow note answered. A moment later, he had discovered the secret spring. The entire rear of the wardrobe swung outward on concealed hinges, revealing a narrow recess lined with green baize. and there, resting upon a velvet cushion as though upon an altar, lay the weapon. It was a perfectly ordinary Malacca walking stick to outward view, ebony handle, silver band, steel ferrule. Yet when Holmes unscrewed the ferrule, the short barrel gleamed inside, and the handle, when pressed in a certain place, released a faint hiss of escaping gas. Beside it lay a small cardboard box containing 20 aluminum cylinders and a tiny charging syringe for the carbonic acid cartridge. A slip of paper in Sir Reginald's spidery hand read, "Ritter pneumatic cane. Dangerous in unskilled hands. Keep concealed." Holmes weighed the thing in his palm, his face grim. "The perfect murderer's tool," he murmured. Light, silent, easily hidden beneath a cloak or skirt, a touch upon the concealed trigger, a soft sigh of air, and a man 12 feet below dies without knowing why. Then the cane is replaced in its hiding place, the plug in the floor restored, and the assassin departs the way she came, by the balcony and the drain pipe. "She?" I echoed. Holmes closed the panel and turned the key in the wardrobe lock. "Come. We have an appointment with the lady in mauve." We descended the main staircase, our candle shielded by Holmes's hand. At the foot of the stairs, a faint line of light showed beneath the drawing-room door. Holmes extinguished the flame, motioned me to silence, and softly turned the handle. The room was lit only by the dying fire. In a high-backed chair before it sat Miss Eleanor Voss, still dressed in the identical gown of pale mauve silk she had worn at dinner 2 nights earlier. Her hands lay folded in her lap, but her eyes, when they rose to meet ours, held neither surprise nor fear, only a weary defiance. "You are punctual, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. "I wondered how long it would take you to find the Ritter cane." Holmes bowed slightly. "Madam, you have played a bold game and played it with consummate skill. May I congratulate you upon the originality of your method?" She gave a faint, bitter smile. "Originality is the one luxury left to the poor relation who wishes to become rich. Sir Reginald intended to marry me to his cousin, a drunken captain who would have run through the estate in 5 years. I preferred to run through it myself." She rose and walked to the mantelpiece where a small silver-framed photograph of the late baronet stood. For a moment her fingers caressed the frame. He was not cruel, only selfish. He collected beautiful things, women among them, and believed that gratitude was the same as affection. When he showed me the pneumatic cane last summer, boasting that it could kill silently across a room, I knew the means had been placed in my hands. Holmes seated himself opposite her, his attitude one almost of sympathy. "Pray tell us the exact sequence, Miss Voss. Dr. Watson is compiling his notes, and the truth, however bitter, deserves to be recorded accurately." She seated herself again, her voice calm, almost conversational. "I bored the hole from the armory weeks ago during one of Sir Reginald's absences in the country. The sawdust I swept into my handkerchief. On the night of the dinner I excused myself at 10 with a headache, went to my room, changed into a dark cloak over this gown, and waited until the house was quiet. At 11 o'clock I slipped onto the balcony, descended the drain pipe. The fresh cement took my footprints perfectly. Entered Sir Reginald's open bedroom window, removed the floor plug, and waited. When I heard his step upon the stairs, I knelt, sighted along the cane, and fired. The bullet dropped straight as a plumb line. I heard the soft thud as he fell forward. I replaced the plug, climbed out again, and was in the corridor with the others before Major Blaine broke the door. And the cartridges in Mr. Carver's pocket? A childish trick I carried, the box upstairs in my muff, and when we stood waiting outside the armory, I brushed against him and slipped it into his coat. Poor Mr. Carver, he is a gentleman, he suspected nothing." Holmes leaned forward. "One point puzzles me still. Why leave the cane in its hiding place? Why not destroy it?" For the first time, her composure wavered. Because it was beautiful, she said simply. The only beautiful thing he ever gave me that was also useful. I could not bring myself to break it. Silence fell, broken only by the settling of the fire. Outside, a church clock struck 12. Holmes rose. "Miss Eleanor Voss, I arrest you for the willful murder of Sir Reginald Hawthorne." She inclined her head. "I expected nothing less, Mr. Holmes, but before you summon the police, permit me one last vanity." She walked to the mirror, smoothed an escaped curl, and turned to my astonishment, smiled at her reflection with perfect serenity. "After all," she said, "I shall be the most elegant woman on the gallows." Holmes watched her with an expression I could not read, admiration perhaps mingled with profound regret. "England does not hang women in public any more, Miss Voss," he said gently. "But I fear the rope remains." She turned then, and for the first time her eyes filled with tears. Not for herself, I think, but for the beauty she had tried to seize and which was slipping forever from her grasp. "Take me away, Mr. Holmes," she whispered. "The game is over." And so in the cold watches of that November night, the lady in mauve walked out between us into the waiting fog, the Ritter cane carried carefully in Holmes's hand like evidence, like a relic, like the instrument of a tragedy as exquisite and terrible as any in the annals of crime. Chapter 6. Footprints in Wet Cement. The arrest of Miss Eleanor Voss should have ended the affair. Yet when we returned to Baker Street in the gray dawn, Holmes was far from satisfied. He paced our sitting room like a caged lynx, filling the air with acrid tobacco smoke and muttering that the case was not yet complete. "There is a loose thread, Watson," said he, flinging himself at last into his chair. "Miss Voss acted alone in the execution, yes, but she did not act alone in the conception. Someone told her where the Ritter cane was hidden. Sir Reginald confided that secret to no one. He wrote as much in the note we found with the weapon. Therefore, another person knew of the hiding place, and that person had a powerful motive for wishing Sir Reginald dead." He relapsed into silence, his brows knitted, his long fingers drumming upon the arm of the chair. Suddenly he sprang up. "The footprints in the cement! I took plaster casts yesterday, but I have not yet compared them with every shoe in the house. Quick, Watson, my lens and the tape." Within half an hour we were back in Belgravia. Grimshaw, hollow-eyed from the events of the night, admitted us without a word. Miss Voss had been removed to Gerald Row Police Station. The house felt like a tomb. Holmes went straight to the servants' quarters and demanded to see every pair of outdoor shoes belonging to the female staff. One by one, the maids brought their stout, sensible boots. None matched the delicate impression in the cement. At last, only one room remained unexamined, the late baronet's own dressing room adjoining his bedroom. There, upon the shoe shelf, stood a pair of ladies' walking boots, black kid size 4, the left heel worn exactly as the cast showed. The soles were still faintly marked with traces of wet cement. Holmes held them up, his eyes glittering. Miss Voss's boots, Watson. Yet she swore she climbed down in stockings to avoid noise. Someone else wore these boots that night, someone who wished us to believe the climber was Miss Voss. He turned to Grimshaw, who had followed us quaking. "Who has access to Miss Voss's wardrobe?" "Only her maid, sir, Ellen Price. But Ellen has been with the family since Miss Eleanor, since she was a child. She would never bring her." Ellen Price proved to be a thin, sharp-featured woman of 30, with restless eyes and a mouth that tightened at the corners when she saw the boots in Holmes's hand. She denied everything at first, but when Holmes laid the plaster cast beside the left boot and demonstrated the identical wear upon the heel, her nerve broke. "It was the Major, sir," she sobbed. "Major Blaine. He came to me a fortnight ago, said Miss Eleanor was in danger of being married against her will. that the master meant to change his will and leave everything to charities. He said if Miss Eleanor could be made heiress, he would have £10,000 and I 500 to keep silent. He told me where the foreign walking stick was hidden and made me help bore the hole from below while the master was away. On the night he gave me the boots and told me to climb down and up again, pressing my feet hard into the new cement so it would look as though Miss Eleanor had done it herself. I thought it was only to cast suspicion away from her. I swear I never knew he meant murder. Holmes's face was very stern. You knew enough, woman. You will speak to the magistrate. Where is Major Blaine now? Gone to his club, sir, the Bagatelle in St. James's. He said he would lie low until the hue and cry died down. Holmes seized his hat. Come, Watson. The quarry seeks cover in the wrong thicket. We took a cab to St. James's, arriving as the club was closing its doors for the night. Major Horace Blaine was in the card-room, a decanter at his elbow, playing whist with 3 elderly colonels. His red face blanched when he saw us. Blaine, said Holmes coldly, I arrest you as accessory before and after the fact in the murder of Sir Reginald Hawthorne. The major attempted bluster. Damned nonsense! I was in the smoking room the whole time. Indeed, replied Holmes. Then explain why your bootmaker in Jermyn Street yesterday morning received an urgent order from you for a new pair of left boots, size 10, because the old ones had been ruined by wet cement. Explain why your valet, when questioned an hour ago, handed over a left boot with the heel scraped clean of the same cement. And explain this. From his pocket, Holmes produced a small scrap of khaki drill, stained with cement and caught upon a nail beside the drain pipe. Your old Afghan campaign tunic, Major, cut down into a working jacket for your nocturnal climb. You wore Miss Voss's boots over your own to leave the prince, then climbed in stockinged feet to avoid noise. You knew the Ritter Kane's hiding place because Sir Reginald had shown it to you in his cups one night at the club, boasting of its deadly silence. You fed the secret to the girl, encouraged her resentment, and planned to share the fortune once she was hanged and the estate fell to the next heir, yourself, as cousin. A pretty scheme, cold-blooded plot. The major's hand stole toward his pocket, but 2 stout porters had already seized his arms. His military mustache drooped like a broken banner. Curse you, Holmes, he muttered. I might have known the devil himself couldn't outwit you. As he was led away, Holmes turned to me with a weary smile. Another thread tied, Watson. The lady in mauve was the hand that fired the silent shot, but the brain belonged to the old soldier who thought war had taught him every trick of killing. He forgot that murder on English soil is a different campaign. Outside, the fog had lifted entirely, and for the first time in days the stars showed cold and bright above the rooftops. Yet as our cab bore us homeward through the silent streets, I could not help feeling that the night still carried an echo of that soft, lethal sigh the Ritter Kane had breathed as it took a man's life without a sound. Chapter 7. The Armory of Sir Reginald. The following morning broke clear and frosty, the first hard light of winter pouring into our sitting room at Baker Street and glittering upon the Ritter Kane, which lay across the breakfast table like a museum curiosity. Holmes had not slept. His eyes were bright with the unnatural luster that always came upon him at the climax of a case, and the table before him was strewn with newspaper cuttings, plaster casts, and the small aluminium bullets ranged in a neat row like silver peas. "Observe, Watson," said he, lifting the cane and pressing the concealed catch. The soft hiss of the last remaining gas sighed out. A toy to the inventor, a fortune to the collector, and sudden death to Sir Reginald Hawthorne, the perfect embodiment of our age. Science placed at the service of murder, yet disguised as an article of gentlemanly attire. He laid the weapon down and turned to the door, for Mrs. Hudson had just announced Inspector Lestrade. The little detective entered with the slightly sheepish air of a terrier that has barked up the wrong tree. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he began, rubbing his hands, "I've come to eat humble pie. Miss Voss has made a full confession, and the maid Price has turned Queen's evidence against Major Blaine. The Yard is satisfied. But there's one thing still puzzles me. How did you know from the very first that the shot came from above?" Holmes smiled indulgently. "My dear Lestrade, when every other possibility has been eliminated, the remainder, however improbable, must be the truth. No pistol was found in a locked room. No powder burns marked the wound. The bullet was aluminium, not lead. The only direction from which a silent, smokeless projectile could have come was from directly above the victim. Once that was granted, the rest followed as surely as night follows day." Lestrade nodded slowly. "All very fine in retrospect. Still, I'll stick to my old methods. They may be slow, but they hang the right man in the end." When he had gone, Holmes relapsed into silence, staring at the cane. I ventured a question that had troubled me since the arrests. "Holmes, do you believe Miss Voss would have hanged if we had not intervened? She is young, beautiful, gently bred. Juries are sometimes merciful." He shook his head. "Mercy is a luxury the law rarely affords to women who poison or shoot their guardians. No, Watson, she would have hanged, and Major Blaine would have inherited through the cousinship, paid his gambling debts, and drunk himself to death in comfort, and the Ritter cane would have remained hidden until the next impatient heir discovered it. That is the true horror of the affair." He rose abruptly. "Come, there is one last duty. The armory must be cleared of its more dangerous treasures before some future collector repeats the tragedy." An hour later, we stood once more in that fatal chamber. The glass cabinets had been unlocked, and upon the long baize-covered tables lay the choicest pieces of Sir Reginald's collection. Flintlocks that had served at Waterloo, percussion revolvers from the Crimea, tiny derringers designed for ladies' reticules, and at the far end the pair of Napoleonic dueling pistols that had been the ostensible reason for the fatal dinner party. Holmes moved among them like a priest performing the last rites. He lifted each weapon, examined the lock, sniffed the barrel, and set it aside with a murmured comment. "Curious how men worship the instruments of death," he said at last. "Here is a Colt that killed 3 men in a Denver gambling saloon. Here a pepper box that ended a duel upon Wimbledon Common in '59. And here," he lifted a tiny muff pistol no longer than my palm, "a weapon made for a woman's hand, used by a jealous wife in the Strand in '73. Everyone has its story written in blood." He came at length to the Ritter cane, still in its place among the walking-stick rifles and sword-sticks. "This, however, is the most insidious of all. It looks harmless, feels, and weighs exactly like an ordinary cane. A man might carry it in Bond Street and no one would look twice. Yet with it one may kill across a crowded room and walk away unnoticed. I have written to Vienna. The remaining 8 specimens are to be destroyed. This one goes to Scotland Yard's Black Museum under triple lock." He wrapped the cane carefully in brown paper, tied it with string, and inscribed the parcel in his neat, precise hand. "Property of the Crown. Ritter pneumatic cane pistol. Do not open without authority of the Commissioner." As we turned to leave, his eye was caught by a small mahogany box upon a high shelf. He reached it down and opened it. Inside, on faded crimson velvet, lay a pair of silver-mounted pocket pistols, beautifully engraved. "These," said he, "belonged to Lord Nelson. They were carried at Trafalgar and never fired in anger. Perhaps the only innocent weapons in the entire collection." He closed the box gently, almost reverently, and for a moment the keen, hawk-like face softened. "Take them, Watson," he said unexpectedly. "A souvenir of the case. Hang them above your desk, and when you look at them, remember that even the instruments of death can sometimes remain unstained. I accepted the gift with a full heart, and we left the armory for the last time. Behind us, the cabinet stood empty, the walls bare, the chalk mark upon the floor already fading. Yet as we descended the stairs, I could not shake the feeling that the house itself breathed a sigh of relief, as though a subtle poison had been drawn from its veins. Outside, the frost sparkled on the pavement, and the air tasted clean and keen. Holmes drew a long breath. "Come, Watson," said he, offering me his arm in rare camaraderie. "There is a coffee stall at the corner that serves an excellent cup at this hour. Let us drink to the memory of a clever woman who might have ruled an empire had she chosen a different path, and to the hope that the next collector of beautiful weapons will collect only those that have never tasted blood." And so we walked away through the bright morning, leaving the armory of Sir Reginald Hawthorne to its silence, its ghosts dispersed at last by the cold, clear light of justice. Chapter 8. A Game of Cards at the Bagatelle Club. The resolution of the Hawthorne murder brought no immediate peace to Sherlock Holmes. If anything, it deepened the shadows that sometimes fell across his mercurial temperament. For days after the arrests, he scarcely stirred from Baker Street, wrapped in his dressing gown, scraping tuneless airs upon his violin or staring moodily into the fire. I knew the signs well. The reaction that followed every great exertion of his powers when the world seemed flat and profitless without a fresh puzzle to engage him. It was upon the fourth evening, as the lamps were lit and the fog once more pressed against our windows like an uninvited guest, that Holmes suddenly flung down his instrument and sprang to his feet. "Watson," said he, "I have been a fool. The case is not yet closed. There is one more player in this deadly game, one who dealt the cards but stayed in the shadows." I stared at him in astonishment. "But Miss Voss and Major Blaine are in custody. The maid has confessed her part. The Ritter cane is safe in the Black Museum. What remains?" He began pacing the room, his thin hands clasped behind him. "The motive, Watson, the root motive. Miss Voss killed for the inheritance, yes, but how did a gently bred girl conceive so intricate a plan? The boring of the hole, the choice of the pneumatic weapon, the planting of the cartridges, these bespeak a military mind, a strategist accustomed to ambush and feint. Blaine, for all his bluster, is a mere infantryman, brave but blunt. No, there is a subtler brain at work, one that profited without firing a shot." He halted before the mantelpiece, his eyes fixed upon the small silver-framed photograph of Irene Adler that he kept there as a reminder of the one adversary who had outwitted him. "Remember Blaine's debts," he murmured. £10,000 to the moneylenders, another 5 to the bookmakers. Yet in the week before the murder, he paid off 3,000 in ready cash. Where did the money come from? Not from his pension, not from Sir Reginald. Someone else supplied the funds, someone who wished Hawthorne dead and Blaine compromised. He wheeled round. "Quick, Watson. Your hat and revolver. We go to the Bagatelle Club. If my theory holds, we shall find the puppet master there, shuffling his cards as though nothing had happened." The Bagatelle Club in St. James's was one of those discreet establishments where retired officers and gentlemen of leisure gathered to play whist and billiards, to smoke cigars and reminisce about campaigns long past. The air was thick with the scent of Havana leaf and old brandy. The walls, paneled in dark oak, hung with trophies from India and the Crimea. We were admitted upon Holmes's card, and the porter directed us to the card room, where a low hum of conversation mingled with the click of ivory counters. At a table by the fire sat 4 players deep in a rubber of whist. One was Major Blaine. No, wait, that could not be, for Blaine was in a cell at Bow Street. Yet the man opposite, dummy for the hand, bore a striking resemblance. The same red face, the same bristling mustache, but older, grayer, with eyes that held a colder gleam. It was Colonel Sebastian Blaine, the Major's elder brother, late of the Bengal Lancers, a man whose name had been whispered in connection with more than one scandal in Simla. Holmes approached the table with the casual air of a member dropping in for a hand. "Colonel Blaine," said he softly. "A word, if you please. In private." The colonel looked up, his cards still fanned in his hand. For an instant, a flicker of alarm crossed, his features swiftly masked. "Holmes? The detective fellow?" "I'm in the middle of a game, sir. It can wait." Holmes's smile was like ice. "I think not, unless you wish me to discuss the Hawthorne murder before these gentlemen, and how you financed your brother's part in it." The colonel's partners exchanged uneasy glances. With a muttered curse, Blaine threw down his cards and rose, leading us to a small alcove curtained off from the room. "Now then," he growled, lighting a cheroot with fingers that shook slightly. "What's this nonsense? My brother's in quad for that business, and serve him right if he hangs. I had nothing to do with it." Holmes seated himself, crossing his legs with elaborate care. "On the contrary, Colonel, you had everything to do with it. You hated Sir Reginald Hawthorne ever since he exposed your card sharping at the Residency in '78, costing you your commission and your reputation. For years you nursed your grudge, watching from afar as he prospered. When you learned through your brother of the Ritter Kane and Hawthorne's hidden wealth, you saw your chance. You supplied the plan, the hole in the floor, the silent shot, the frame upon poor Carver. You advanced the 3,000 to Horace to whet his appetite, promising the rest when the estate fell to him as next heir after Miss Voss was hanged. A neat scheme, sir, almost worthy of Moriarty himself." The colonel's face had turned the color of old parchment. He crushed out his cheroot and leaned forward, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You have no proof, Holmes, not a shred." "Ah, but I have," replied Holmes calmly. He drew from his pocket a small envelope and shook out its contents, a few grains of pale blue powder. "Prussian blue, Colonel, the rare pigment used in the forgery of banknotes. Your brother paid his debts with notes traced to a batch passed in Paris last month, notes whose ink contains this exact shade. You obtained them from your associates in the underworld, the same men who supplied the aluminium bullets machined to Ritter's specifications. The yard has the chain complete." Blaine sagged back in his chair, all bluster gone. "It was Reginald's fault," he muttered. "He ruined me, turned me into a sharper to survive. I only wanted justice." "Justice?" echoed Holmes. "You call murder justice? No, sir, you wanted revenge and gold to feed your vices. Your brother was your tool, Miss Voss, your unwitting dupe. She believed she acted alone, but every step was guided by your whispers through Horace." The colonel buried his face in his hands. "What will you do?" Holmes rose. "Summon Lestrade. You will confess, or I shall lay the evidence before the magistrates myself." As we waited for the inspector, the card room beyond the curtain hummed on undisturbed, the players calling their bids and laughing over their tricks. Yet in that alcove a man's life had ended as surely as if the Ritter Kane had sighed its silent death upon him. Lestrade arrived within the half-hour, his face alight with professional zeal. The colonel went quietly, his head bowed, the game of cards at the Bagatelle Club his last. Back in Baker Street, as the fire burned low, I asked Holmes how he had unraveled the final knot. "Elementary, my dear Watson," said he. "When a soldier pays debts with forged notes, look to his family. The Blaines were ever a bad lot, and now, if you please, the violin. Music to soothe the echoes of a sordid affair." He took up his Stradivarius, and as the sweet strains filled the room, I reflected that in the great game of crime and detection, Sherlock Holmes was ever the master player, turning the cards of fate with a skill that left lesser men in awe. Chapter 9. The second shot that was never fired. The trial of the three conspirators began at the Old Bailey on a raw February morning when the wind off the river cut like a knife. London had not only followed the case, it devoured it. The newspapers called it the silent murder, the lady in mauve, or in the more lurid sheets, the pneumatic poison of Belgravia. Crowds gathered before dawn to secure places in the public gallery. Ladies fainted when the Ritter cane was produced in court, and the judge's summing up lasted 3 full days. Miss Eleanor Voss appeared each morning in the same gown of pale mauve silk, her face calm, almost luminous, as though she had already passed beyond earthly judgment. Major Horace Blaine, stripped of his military bearing, sat hunched and sullen, refusing to look at his brother. Colonel Sebastian Blaine, the eldest, preserved a stony dignity, but his hands trembled whenever the aluminium bullet was passed from witness to witness. I attended every session, partly for the sake of my notes, partly because Holmes insisted I should see justice done to the end. Holmes himself gave evidence only once, quietly, precisely, devastatingly. When he stepped down, the jury looked as though they had been struck by lightning. On the 6th day, the verdicts came. Eleanor Voss was found guilty of willful murder, but with a strong recommendation to mercy on account of her youth and the provocation of threatened, forced marriage. Sentence of death was pronounced, yet within a fortnight the Home Secretary commuted it to penal servitude for life. She was taken to Woking convict prison, where, I later learned, she became a model prisoner and spent her days teaching embroidery to the other women. Major Horace Blaine received 15 years for manslaughter and conspiracy. He died of drink and despair in Dartmoor 2 winters later. Colonel Sebastian Blaine, the architect of the whole, was sentenced to hang. He met his end on a March morning with the same rigid correctness he had shown throughout the trial, asking the chaplain to convey his compliments to Mr. Sherlock Holmes and to the last. Yet even after the sentences, one small mystery remained. A mystery that troubled Holmes more than all the rest. On the evening the verdicts were announced, he sat long before the fire, the Ritter cane across his knees, turning it over and over. "There is a second shot that was never fired," he said at last, almost to himself. "And that is the one that disturbs me most." I begged him to explain. "Consider the facts, Watson. The Ritter cane held enough compressed gas for 6 discharges. We recovered 5 aluminium bullets from the cardboard box in the wardrobe. 1 bullet was fired into Sir Reginald. That leaves 4 unfired. Yet when the cane was examined at Scotland Yard, the reservoir was almost empty. Only a whisper of gas remained. Where, then, did the missing charge go?" He rose and began pacing, his dressing gown flapping like great black wings. "Someone test-fired the weapon after the murder, perhaps only hours after. Someone who wished to be certain the Ritter cane would never speak again in evidence. Someone who believed a single additional shot, fired harmlessly into a pillow or a sandbag, would exhaust the gas and render the mechanism harmless. A clever thought, but they forgot that carbonic acid gas leaves a faint frost upon cold metal. The morning after the murder, the silver band of the cane was rimed with frost, though the bedroom fire had burned all night. That frost told me the reservoir had been recently discharged. I confess I was baffled. But the prisoners were all in custody by then." "Exactly," said Holmes grimly. "Therefore the person who fired the second shot was still at liberty. And there was only one person who had both opportunity and motive to silence the cane forever." He crossed to the writing desk and took up a small object wrapped in tissue. Unfolding it, he revealed a single aluminium bullet, slightly flattened at the tip. "This was found embedded in the trunk of the old elm behind the Hawthorne mansion, 6 feet from the ground. The bark around the wound was freshly broken. Someone stood beneath that tree in the early hours after the murder and fired the remaining charge into the wood, believing the bullet would never be found." He paused, his eyes very bright. The footprints beneath the tree were those of a man size 9 military tread, the right boot showing a patch where a nail had been replaced. Grimshaw the butler wears size 9 boots, Watson. Grimshaw who stood to lose his position if Miss Voss were disinherited. Grimshaw who worshipped the girl from childhood and who overheard every whispered plan between her and the Major. He could not save her from the gallows, but he could try to destroy the chief exhibit that condemned her. I was silent, moved almost to tears by the thought of the old servant's hopeless devotion. Holmes wrapped the bullet again and laid it beside the cane. I have spoken to Lestrade. The charge will not be pressed. A man who fires a silent shot to shield the woman he loves even when she is murdered has already suffered the heaviest sentence life can impose. He stood at the window, looking out at the swirling fog. 3 lives ruined. 1 ended on the gallows, and all for a walking stick that could kill without a sound. There is a moral here, Watson, sharper than any bullet. The most dangerous weapons are not those of steel and powder, but the hidden resentments we carry in silence until one day they fire their deadly charge into the heart of everything we hold dear. He turned back to the fire, his profile sharp against the flames. And that second shot, the one that was never fired at a human target, will echo longer in my memory than the first, for it was fired out of love. And love, my dear friend, is the only force on earth more silent and more lethal than any Austrian inventor ever conceived. He fell silent then, and I did not disturb him. Outside, the fog closed in again, thick and yellow as on the morning Felix Carver had burst into our rooms. But within, the fire burned clear and steady, and for once I felt that justice, imperfect though it might be, had been tempered with something very like mercy. Chapter 10. The Concealed Weapon. Some weeks after the last echo of the Hawthorne case had died away in the newspapers, there came a soft April evening when the air through our open window carried the scent of lilac from Regent's Park, and the promise that winter had truly loosed its grip. Holmes had been unusually quiet all day, turning the pages of an old black-letter volume without reading them, his violin untouched upon the table. At length he laid the book aside, stretched his long arms above his head, and spoke in the low, reflective tone he kept for the closing of a chapter. "Pack. We may lay the Hawthorne affair to rest at last, Watson. The files are complete, the exhibits locked away, the sentences served or awaiting service. Yet one small ceremony remains." He rose, crossed to the coal scuttle, and from its depths, where he was wont to hide objects too precious or too dangerous for the common gaze, drew forth the Ritter pneumatic cane, still wrapped in its brown paper parcel. The string had been broken and retied many times during the trial, but the label in his own neat hand remained, "Property of the Crown." "I have obtained permission," he said, "to perform the final office myself. Come." He led me down the 17 steps past a surprised Mrs. Hudson and into the street. A hansom took us eastward through the quiet city, past the law courts and along the embankment where the Thames slid dark and smooth beneath the lamps. At length we alighted in a narrow lane behind Scotland Yard itself, but at a side door known only to a few. A sergeant on night duty saluted Holmes and ushered us down stone stairs into the basement where the Black Museum keeps its grim relics. In a small, white-tiled room lit by a single gas jet stood an iron anvil, and beside it a brazier already glowing. Holmes unwrapped the cane with the care of a priest handling a chalice. The malacca gleamed, the silver band winked, the ebony handle curved with innocent grace. "Steel and aluminium, rubber and compressed air," he murmured. "4 materials, 1 deadly purpose. Watch, Watson." He laid the cane across the anvil. From the wall he took a heavy hammer. The first blow rang out sharp and clear, denting the reservoir. The second cracked the barrel. With the third, the silver band sprang away like a broken necklace. Again and again he struck until the beautiful, terrible thing was reduced to a twisted knot of metal. The rubber bulb burst, the delicate mechanism shattered beyond repair. When it was done, he gathered the fragments into a small iron box, sealed it, and inscribed upon the lid in black paint, Ritter Kane pistol, destroyed by S.H., the 17th April 1895. Only then did he permit himself a long breath, as though a weight had been lifted from his spirit. We emerged into the night. The fog had vanished. Overhead the stars burned with the cold brilliance of spring. Holmes paused on the embankment, looking across the river to where the lights of the Surrey side trembled upon the water. "Do you remember, Watson, what I said when first we examined that weapon? That the most dangerous armament is not carried in the hand, but in the heart?" I nodded. Miss Voss carried resentment. Major Blaine carried greed. The colonel carried revenge. Even poor Grimshaw carried a love too fierce for his silence. All of them concealed weapons more lethal than any Austrian patent. He was silent a moment, then went on more softly. "And I, Watson? What do I conceal? A brain that will not rest, a restlessness that drives me to the edge of the abyss and sometimes over it. Cocaine when the game is scarce, solitude when friendship offers warmth, the chase itself when justice has already been served. My own concealed weapon, perhaps, is the conviction that I must always be right, that feeling is weakness and mercy an indulgence. Tonight, for once, I chose to break a machine instead of a human spirit. Perhaps that is progress." He turned to me then, and in the lamplight I saw something I had seldom seen in those keen gray eyes, a glimmer of humility. "You are my safety valve, old friend. You record, you humanize, you forgive. Without you, I might long ago have become the most dangerous man I pursue." I could find no words. He laid a hand briefly upon my shoulder, the rarest of gestures, and hailed a passing cab. Back in Baker Street, the fire had sunk to embers. Holmes poured 2 glasses of the old Amontillado, handed me one, and raised his own. "To concealed weapons," he said. "May we have the courage to recognize them before they fire, and the grace to dismantle them when they do." We drank. Outside, a nightingale began to sing in the plane trees, a sound so pure and improbable in the heart of London that it seemed to belong to another world. Holmes listened, head cocked, a faint smile upon his lips. "Write the story, Watson," he said at last. "Call it whatever you please, the adventure of the silent pistol, the lady in mauve, the concealed weapon. But let the lessons stand clear. The hand may hold a cane, a knife, a revolver, but the heart holds the true murderer or the true redeemer. Guard it well." He took up his violin, drew the bow across the strings, and the room filled with a slow, haunting melody that seemed to carry all the sorrow and all the hope of the case we had just closed. I sat late into the night, pen in hand, setting down these final words while the music lasted, knowing that this adventure, more than any other, had touched something deeper than intellect in my friend, something almost, though he would never admit it, like a soul. And so the Hawthorne affair passed into my archives, another strand in the long, strange tapestry of our life together. The fragments of the Ritter cane lie to this day in their iron box in the Black Museum, harmless now, a curiosity for future generations. Yet whenever I pass a gentleman leaning upon an elegant Malacca in Bond Street, or hear the soft pop of champagne in a restaurant, or see a lady's gloved hand tighten upon a hidden resentment, I remember the silent shot that killed Sir Reginald Hawthorne and the second silent shot that was fired out of love. Both were concealed weapons. Only one was ever truly disarmed. The fire burned low. Holmes's bow fell silent. Somewhere in the quiet house a clock struck 2. My friend laid the violin in its case, stretched, and gave me the tired, contented smile of a man who has done good work and knows it. "Good night, Watson," said he. And thank you for keeping the concealed weapon in my own heart from ever quite going off." With that, he retired to his room, leaving me alone with the dying coals and the knowledge that, of all the victories we had won together, this quiet April evening was perhaps the greatest. For on that night Sherlock Holmes had looked into the darkness we all carry and chosen for once to lay the weapon down.